Hello, Lost Foam Casters. I'm back with you today because I've been fielding some questions about the kind of materials I use in my Lost Foam pattern making. So I thought I'd take a few minutes and go over three areas of pattern building materials with you, and namely foams, glues, and waxes. So those are kind of my three basic pattern building materials. And I'll take the easiest one first is foam. For foam, I like to use extruded polystyrene. And the difference between extruded polystyrene and expanded polystyrene is extruded polystyrene is a closed cell foam. It's made by different manufacturers. The color of it really doesn't have anything to do with what it is. It's just branding. I use the Owens Corning product because it's available in the densities I like, and I'll get to that in a minute. All of their product is pink because that's their marketing and branding. You know, they got the Pink Panther and all that cute stuff. Dow has equivalent products. Theirs are light blue, and I think that there's a handful of other manufacturers out there too. But the reason I like extruded polystyrene is because it's closed cell. It machines very nicely, and it sands and finishes very nicely. And it's available at the big box stores in 2-inch 4-foot by 8-foot planks or 1-inch by 4-foot by 8-foot planks. And it's reasonably inexpensive on that. So that's what I like to use as my primary pattern material. There are half a dozen different densities available from Owens Corning. The most common ones that are available in the big box stores are what they call their Foamular is their brand name for it. But they have two densities that are most commonly available, and that's the Foamular 150 and the Foamular 250. Foamular 150 is 1.3 pounds per cubic foot, and Foamular 250 is 1.5 pounds per cubic foot. And I've used both of them with success. I use the 150 the most. Sometimes if you have a thin-walled part or something that's fragile, I'll use the 250 on that, especially if it's not a very big part, not a lot of foam to evaporate. But I'll have another video up on pattern making and so on and working the materials. But that's my basic go-to material. But I also use a fair amount of expanded polystyrene. And expanded polystyrene is typically the white stuff, like you see in the background. And the difference is, instead of it being extruded with a foaming agent and being a very fine closed cell structure, expanded polystyrene is made from expanded beads whose density is controlled by the amount of bead and foaming agent they put in there. And you'll recognize it because you can see the trace elements, you know, of the foam. Like here I'm showing you, that's the beaded expanded polystyrene. And where I use EPS, expanded polystyrene, is mostly in sprues, runners, and gates, and I use very low density forms of that. I mean, usually between 0.8 of a pound per cubic foot and 1 pound per cubic foot, depending on what I'm doing. But I don't typically use it for pattern building because it doesn't machine and finish quite as nicely as extruded polystyrene does. But there are a couple things about it is I have a hard time getting extruded polystyrene in thick planks, thicker than 2 inches. And it turns out that laminating polystyrene into thicker blocks is kind of a problem when it comes to finishing and machining through that joint. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But one of the other advantages of expanded polystyrene is you can buy it in big blocks. So if you have a big pattern that you're going to machine that you want to do all in one piece, you can buy a block of expanded polystyrene. You have to hunt around for it a little bit. And usually you can buy it to whatever density that you want. So you usually have to be in the vicinity of where it's available because shipping it will just absolutely kill you cost-wise. Cost-wise, it's usually economical, but shipping is much more than the cost of the product itself because it takes up so much space on that. But occasionally I will use it, and the other thing about it is that a lot of people don't like the extruded or the expanded polystyrene because the beads print through and you see them in your pattern work. But you know, if you actually sand it, you can tell. I've sanded here a little bit. So there's the very classical expanded polystyrene bead that you see. And then here I just swiped that a couple of times with a 220 grit sandpaper. And that's what I'd encourage you to do is you'll find that the white polystyrene used for packing material, it varies quite a bit, and most of what it varies by is density. So experiment with it a little bit, grab a piece of 220 sandpaper and just see how it finishes up. And if you can sand a smooth finish on it, it might be just fine, you know, for making your patterns. And most of the time it's free, or you're going to throw it away, and they don't like it in the landfills. It's not recyclable, and it takes up a ton of space in your garbage bin. So use it for lost foam. That's what I do. So. Well, really, that's it for foam. I mean, I machine it, cut it, and assemble it in all kinds of different ways, but that's not the subject of this particular video. The other thing that we want to talk about, since assembling cut pieces together is part of pattern building, is glues. And if it's a small object, what I like to do for glue is I like to use hot melt glue. You see my hot melt gun here. And I use the lowest melting temperature hot melt glue I can find. And there's nothing particularly fancy about this other than it's a super low temperature glue. You can buy this on Amazon if you search what's on there. But this brand, there's nothing magical about this brand. But if you don't use a low temperature hot melt glue, what happens is the hot melt glue itself melts at a higher temperature than the polystyrene, and it'll damage your polystyrene when you apply it to the polystyrene. And one thing that I forgot to mention earlier about foams, a couple of things I didn't mention is don't use urethane foams. Urethane foams are like the insulating foams you buy in the aerosol cans, or the ones that are two-part systems that you spray together into a bag to make kind of custom fit shipping stuff. And the reason that you don't want to use urethane foams is, yeah, it does emit a nasty odor. I mean, you burn any plastic and it does. But the real reason for lost foam casting, it's not a good choice because those urethanes are thermoset plastics. They're not thermoplastics. And the difference is thermoset plastics become plastic through a chemical reaction, and thermoplastics become solid from liquid through a temperature phase change. And that temperature phase change is what's really important in lost foam casting, because for lost foam to work properly, the hot metal, the first thing that happens is the foam melts and then it turns to gas. But you've got between the hot metal and the foam pattern, you've got gaseous foam, you've got liquid foam, and then you've got solid foam. And that liquid and gaseous foam is how the foam pattern is evaporated and eliminated through the mold wall. So don't use urethane foams. So anyway, back to glue. If you use that high temperature or the normal temperature hot melt glue, I found that it damages your polystyrene and melts it where you apply it. The other thing I'll tell you about glue is whether it's hot melt. I mean, I use hot melt for sticking small parts together. The problem with hot melt is it works really well, but you don't have much working time with it. So if you have a large area or a complicated thing to fit together, the glue is going to cool and become hard and make for a really fat joint if you can even get it together in time. If it's gluing two pieces together like these little cylindrical bosses, no problem. It's fast. I use it for sprues and attaching sprues in small pieces together. I mean, it's just instant. You can build a pattern real fast. But the other thing that people don't appreciate is that you can use just polyvinyl acetate or just white glue. I mean, the most common one that most people are familiar with is just Elmer's white glue, and it'll work just fine. You know, most types of PVA glues, even the more engineered woodworking glues, they'll work. They get a little bit more difficult as far as how hard they are in the joint if you're going to try to sand or work the joint. I've tried a lot of different glues, and by far my favorite is Arlene's Fast Grab Tacky Glue. And the only thing that's different about the Fast Grab Tacky Glue is, just as the name suggests, it really grips and it tends to be self-fixturing, and you don't have to tape or weight or hold them in place. Now, I bought a sample pack from Arlene's that had 5 of these little bottles in here, and one's clear, and one's the original, and one says clear gel, and one says quick dry. I really didn't find much difference in any of them, but the one that I really did like was this Fast Grab Tacky Glue. Now, I got it stored upside down because it's so viscous, it takes forever to work its way down to the spout if I don't. But the one thing that I wanted to show you is I'll put just a little bit of it on here and show you how I apply glue and why. But whether it is hot melt glue or white glue like this Fast Grab Tacky Glue, I use it very sparingly, and then I'll take the 2 pieces and I'll smear them together like this. And with the hot melt glue, you got to be fast about doing it and shear it off. But you see here, you can't even hardly see that the glue is on there. And then when you put them back together, if you can just twist or slide them just a little bit, they are stuck fast. I mean, if that's hot melt glue there, that thing is permanently stuck right now. I can take it apart again or reposition it for quite a while. You see here, I can slide it, I can move it. And that's the beauty of the white glues, particularly the Fast Grab white glue, is you can move the part around before it sets up and position it. The downside of it is that if you're going to do much with the piece after you put it together, you got to wait for it to set. And it depends on your weather conditions and where you live, but if you live in a hot, dry climate, usually in an hour or so, it'll be set up enough that you aren't going to move it around very much. You can also place little strips of tape on there to help hold things in place from becoming dislodged. If you aren't going to work it hard, I mean, I could handle this thing all day long, because it's actually, the tacky glue is, well, pretty tacky on that. The last thing that I'll mention in glues that you can use is two-sided tape. Two-sided tape works all right also. And two-sided tape is something that you can actually think about using if you're trying to laminate sheets. And when I say two-sided tape, I don't mean the big fat stuff like you stick to walls for hanging pictures and stuff. I mean the stuff that is like the thickness of Scotch tape or packing tape, but it's just got adhesive, pressure-sensitive adhesive on both sides. And you can stick foam boards together with that stuff, and it's so thin it'll melt and evaporate pretty easily as well. But the only other honorable mention that I'll give when it comes to laminating, and I'm talking about laminating, is as I mentioned, I can only get anyway 2-inch thick extruded polystyrene boards at the big box stores. Supposedly they're available in up to 6 inches, and if you go to the big box stores and search their websites, you'll see that they'll have 4 or 6 inches. But if you call and you try to buy a single sheet from them, you'll find out you've got to buy a whole truckload of it in order for them to bring it into their plant for you. But one thing that I also had a reasonable degree of success with for laminating is shellac. And this is just ordinary off-the-shelf furniture shellac. And the reason that shellac works is because the solvent in shellac is alcohol. And alcohol will not attack the polystyrene foam. And how you use shellac as a glue, you just brush it on with the foam brush, and being alcohol, it dries really, really quickly. And I'd usually put 2 coats on each side that I'm going to stick together. And then for the 3rd coat, I'd just take the foam brush and recoat quickly and lightly the sides that I'd already coated. And that second application reactivates the first layer, and you can stick them together like contact cement. And because it's alcohol, if you've got a sheet that's a foot square, there's a decent chance you can get that alcohol to evaporate out of that joint. If it's a water-based glue, it will be wet in the middle of that 1 foot square forever, and you'll never get it dry unless you cook that thing at a temperature that is going to damage your foam. So the things that I haven't mentioned that people use, the usual contact cements, spray contact cements, I don't think are worth a darn, and 90% of them have solvents in them that will attack the foam. Still, if you mist them on very, very lightly, you can get away with using it. But I think what you'll find is that you'll always have this gooey layer where that contact cement is. And if you ever try to cut or machine through that layer, it's just a mess. I mean, that layer will load up your cutting bit instantaneously and ruin your pattern if you're machining something. And if you're carving or cutting through it, it makes a mess. Or if you're trying to sand through it, it's just an absolute mess. The shellac is actually the best in that regard. The joint is still quite a bit harder than the foam, so it's hard to get a uniform joint if you're sanding on it, but at least it doesn't blow up your pattern because it sticks to your cutting bit. And by the way, all these other glues will do that too, and that's why you want to use so very, very little of them, whether they're hot glue or whether they're these glues, or the white glues. Same thing with a sanding belt. If you touch it to a sanding belt, that sanding belt will reactivate that hot glue in a second, and you'll have a big glue smeared patch on your sanding belt, just like it sticks to your cutter bit. So anyway, enough on glues on that. The last subject is waxes. So I've tried a lot of waxes, and the wax that I use is this. It comes from Freeman Manufacturing and Supply Company, and they're a very reputable and long-time supplier of pattern-making materials to the pattern and foundry industry. And the particular product that I use is this Master Bond wax. And the reason I use Master Bond is this wax is specially formulated to melt at the same temperature as polystyrene to melt away and evaporate, to burn away. So it's got a very, very similar temperature at which it evaporates, turns to liquid, and then to gas. And that makes it behave more like the foam, and that enables you to keep the flaw population down. I still use it very sparingly, but the most common thing that I do with it is apply fillets. Now, if I take this is actually an 1/8 inch fillet, and that's what that box is right there. And if I show you a little peek in there, it's 2-foot strips full of that. Now that box is, well, it'd probably be a lifetime supply for most lost foam casters. It costs about 35 bucks, but it's good stuff. And if you want good results, you should buy the right materials. If you go to Freeman Supply, their website, you can view all their products, but you won't be able to see their pricing unless you open up an online account. And I'd advise, if you're really interested in pattern making materials, that you do that. It's only within the last few years that they've allowed online accounts and small buyers to be able to buy from them. But they're a good company with very good materials on that. So I won't get into laying the fillet so much, but I usually prefer to try to cut a fillet in the foam. Some cases that's not practical, but the other thing that you need to lay fillet properly are fillet tools. And these I've had for 30 years from pattern making and whatnot. You can buy these from Freeman too. They're pretty darned expensive from them, being professional pattern makers equipment. But if you go to like Amazon or to eBay and you search fillet tool, you can buy the import ones that are, they're about 2/3 this length, but you can get the diameters you want for $5 or $10. They're pretty inexpensive. So, and the other thing that comes with them is scrapers. So sometimes when you wipe in the fillet, you have a little excess that squeezes out, and then you take this radius scraper, and then you just, and I forgot to mention that in order to lay the fillet, I heat the fillet tool with a hot air gun. Some people use an alcohol lamp. Sometimes if you wave the wax in front of it and soften it up a little bit before you go to apply it, that helps a lot too. But if you heat your tools, they'll just cut right through that wax like a hot knife through butter, and you can get some nice professional looking results with the fillet. The last thing I'll mention about the wax is you can also use it to make appliques. In this case, I'll show you an example. I made a custom part number for a part that I was making. All that is some foundry letters stuck to a little piece of aluminum plate. And then I cast a silicone mold from that plate, which is a negative of it. And then I melted a little bit of this wax in a spoon underneath the hot air gun and just poured the hot wax in the open face mold, and then took a hot razor blade, a razor knife, and just as it started to solidify, just struck it off so it was flat. And after it cooled, you just flex the mold a little bit and you can peel it right out of there. Now, what that comes in handy for is for small letters, and I call appliques, if you have an embossment or a logo or something that's intricate but will cast through, you can pull a rubber mold off of it, make a wax applique, and then just use that tacky glue to attach the wax applique to your foam pattern, and you can customize your foam patterns with whatever type of embossments or logos or part numbers or wording suits yourself on that. So anyway, the only other thing I'll say on waxes is that people use all kinds of waxes. You want a really low melting point wax. Some people successfully used toilet seal rings, the seals for toilets. That's a very, very low temperature wax. You can move that at room temperature. You can stick your finger into one of those. And the other thing I might mention too is that if you want to make some wax fillet and you have some wax, there is one technique here I forgot about, is I use these plastic syringes, and I've got some of that Master Bond wax in there. And you can do one of two things. You can heat it in front of the hot air gun, or you can just get one of those coffee cup heaters and dial it to the right temperature where the temperature is just right, put hot water in it, and then just keep this syringe in there. And then you can cut the opening here on the syringe down to whatever diameter of rope that you want, and you can extrude out rope fillet, if you will. And you know, the fillet, it's nice if it's fillet shaped like that, but it doesn't have to be. It can be round, and you can use just the fillet tool and get it hot enough, and the fillet tool will melt the round rope right into the joint that you want. So that's a way to experiment with waxes and make your own rope fillet, and it works pretty good. You know, like I said, I prefer the professional stuff, but hey, we don't all have the ability to justify that. But that's just it for waxes. Oh, I should mention too, you can also use wax to patch small defects in the surface. So if you dent, or if you get a little tear or a little pock mark, just use one of these scrapers and heat up the edge of it, put a little chunk of wax on there, and just use it like a trowel, and you can patch little defects and damaged spots in your foam patterns with that same wax. So, well, that's all I had for you today. I mean, there's really, as far as my patterns, there's nothing exotic in there. I'll try to put a couple links at the end of the video that might be useful to you. As always, I've got tons of other information about pattern materials in my posts at thehomefoundry.org. Be sure to check out that website and join. There's a ton of information, not only about lost foam casting, but about all kinds of castings, and you've got all kinds of people from hobbyists to professionals there that can really help you out with questions and methods on that. So until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the flip side.